The inheritance of evil. The sky was grey when Reverend Richard Henderson arrived at Old Thornwick Manor. A heavy mist clung to the fields, winding through the twisted branches of dead trees like pale fingers. The estate, a sprawling stone relic of another century, loomed in the distance, its dark windows unblinking eyes, its towers jagged against the sky. Richard had been here once before, as a child. The memories had long since faded, but the feeling of the place remained etched into his bones. This was not a home, it was a waiting grave. He stepped out of the carriage, boots crunching against the wet gravel of the long, silent drive. The wind howled through the barren oaks, but there was something beneath it. A whispering he could not quite hear. The housekeeper, Mrs. Weatherby, stood at the top of the stone steps. She was an old woman, her face lined with years of worry, her eyes sunken but sharp. She did not smile. "Welcome back, Reverend," she murmured. Her voice was tired. Richard nodded, gripping his satchel. "It's been a long journey." Mrs. Weatherby's gaze flickered toward the graveyard that stretched behind the house, the family plot. "It has been waiting for you," she said. Richard's breath hitched. She turned without another word, pushing open the heavy oak doors. They groaned in protest, revealing the dark, yawning corridor beyond. Richard hesitated. A shadow passed across the upper landing. No one was there, and yet something had moved. The letter that shouldn't exist. The study smelled of dust and old parchment. The fireplace had long since died out, and the air held the damp chill of a room long forgotten. Richard set his satchel down and approached the large oak desk. The last time he had stood here, he had been a boy, staring up at his grandfather's towering figure as he wrote in his ledger. Now the desk was bare, except for one thing, a letter sealed with black wax. The envelope was aged, brittle, yet the ink on its surface was clear, too fresh. It was addressed to him. Reverend Richard Henderson, heir to Thornwick Manor. Richard's chest tightened. He had never received a letter before his grandfather's passing, had never been told about an inheritance. His fingers trembled as he broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of parchment. The ink was faded, but the words burned into his mind. "He still walks. If the bones are disturbed, he will come back." Bone to his bone. The fire in the hearth roared to life. Richard staggered backward, the heat searing his skin, though he had touched nothing. The letter, the cursed letter, was gone, consumed by the flames. A sudden gust of wind howled through the manor, rattling the window panes. And somewhere beyond the walls, something knocked. The grave that wouldn't stay buried. Mrs. Weatherby was waiting for him in the corridor. "You found the letter." It wasn't a question. Richard swallowed hard. "Who wrote it?" Her eyes darkened. "It was not meant to be read." She turned and began walking toward the back of the house. Richard hesitated before following, his stomach twisting. The corridors seemed longer than they should have been, the candlelight casting too many shadows. They reached a set of heavy doors, old and warped with time. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated before pushing them open. Beyond them, the graveyard. The stones were ancient, some crumbling, their names long worn away by time. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, and the air was too still. Mrs. Weatherby led him toward the edge of the graveyard, where the land dipped into a small hollow. Richard's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. The ground here was disturbed. The earth had been moved. The grave, unmarked, sat beneath a twisted yew tree, its roots snaking over the earth like clawed hands. Richard's voice was hoarse. "Who is buried here?" Mrs. Weatherby's wrinkled hands tightened around her shawl. "They tried to bury him," she whispered. Richard's chest tightened. "Who?" She didn't look at him. She was looking at the ground. "They tried," she repeated, "but the earth refused him." The wind howled through the trees. Richard took a step closer, his boots sinking into the soft, damp soil. It was loose, like it had been dug up recently. He crouched down, pressing his palm to the dirt. It was damp, cold, too fresh. Richard's heart pounded. Someone had been here, recently. And then, something brushed against his hand. Something cold, something thin. Richard jerked back, his breath catching in his throat. A sliver of bone protruded from the soil. The first omen. Richard stared at the exposed bone, bile rising in his throat. He had seen skeletal remains before. He had conducted funeral rites, presided over burials. But this was wrong. It looked fresh, still white, as if it had never decayed. The wind picked up again, whispering through the trees. The graveyard creaked. And then a sound echoed through the night, software deliberate, like bones knocking together. Richard's breath caught. He turned his head slowly, scanning the shadows beyond the graves. Nothing. Just darkness. Mrs. Weatherby's voice was tight with fear. "You must leave it alone." Richard swallowed, his throat dry. "Who is buried here?" She shook her head. "Not buried," she murmured. "Never buried." Nathaniel's blood turned to ice. Before he could respond, a deep, heavy thud echoed behind them, the sound of a door slamming shut. From inside the manor, Richard turned sharply. In the window of his study, a shadow moved, tall, unnatural, watching him. The whisper in the dark. The house felt different when they stepped inside. The air was thick, pressing against Richard's skin. The candles flickered, their flames shivering, throwing twisting shadows against the walls. Richard reached for his satchel, trying to steady his nerves. Then, a noise. Software, a faint, dry, clicking sound. Like bones shifting in the dark. Richard froze. It was coming from upstairs, from his study. Mrs. Weatherby's breath hitched, and then a single knock. Not at the door, not at the walls. From inside the house. Richard turned, his breath shallow. The study door was slightly open, the candlelight flickered inside. Then, a whisper, low, breathless, bone to his bone. Richard stepped back, and from inside the study, the sound of something shifting, something long, something without flesh. The whispering grew, the shadows moved, and the thing that should have been buried took its first step toward him. The unearthed horror. The manor was silent, but Richard could feel it. Something inside the house had shifted. The whisper, bone to his bone, still echoed in his mind, curling around his thoughts like creeping ivy. The study door remained slightly open, candlelight flickering weakly from within, its glow barely touching the deep shadows beyond the threshold. And the sound, that dry, brittle clicking, had not stopped. Something was moving inside. Richard swallowed, his pulse a hammer against his ribs. Mrs. Weatherby stood behind him, her breathing uneven, her wrinkled fingers clutching at her shawl as if it could protect her. "You mustn't go in," she whispered. But Richard was already stepping forward. Something was in his study, and he needed to see it. The first sign of the dead. Richard pushed the door slowly. It creaked, not from the hinges but from the wood itself, as if the house was groaning under the weight of something too old, too heavy. The room beyond was exactly as he left it, and yet wrong. The papers on his desk had been moved. The ink bottle, spilled, and in the center of the desk, neatly placed atop his grandfather's old ledger, sat a single human bone. Richard's throat tightened. It was long, pale, and too clean, as if it had never spent a day beneath the earth. He knew what it was. A humerus, a bone from an arm. Mrs. Weatherby gasped, stumbling backward. Her face was ashen, her lips moving in silent prayers. Richard forced himself to move closer. The moment his fingers brushed the bone, the candles died. A violent gust of wind slammed through the room, sending papers flying, knocking books from the shelves. The fire in the hearth roared to life, but its flames burned black, throwing twisted, flickering shadows across the walls. Then the whispering returned. Bone to his bone. Richard spun toward the door, his heart pounding. The whisper hadn't come from the study, it had come from below. From the graveyard. The unearthed grave. The night air was thick with mist, curling low over the grass like skeletal fingers. The wind carried a damp, rotting scent, as if something deep in the earth had been disturbed. Richard gripped his lantern, his knuckles white. Mrs. Weatherby refused to follow him. Instead, she stood on the manor steps, watching with wide, sunken eyes, shaking her head. "You should not do this," she whispered. But Richard had to know. The moment his boots touched the soft earth of the graveyard, the wind died. No sound. not even the rustling of the trees. Everything was still. Richard hesitated, his breath shallow. Then he saw it, the unmarked grave. It was open, the dirt had been dug away, revealing the rotting wood of a broken coffin. The grave he had seen the day before, the one that had already felt disturbed, had been unearthed completely. And it was empty. Richard's stomach twisted violently. The bones were gone. Only the burial shroud remained, draped in tattered cloth, the faint shape of something that had once been human still pressed into the dirt. A gust of wind rushed through the graveyard, carrying with it the sharp scent of decay. Richard's fingers tightened around the lantern handle. And then he saw the footprints, leading away from the grave, not boot prints, not shoes, bare feet, thin, long, bone-thin. The footprints staggered toward the house, back toward Old Thornwick Manor, and at that moment something moved behind him. The whispering dead. Richard turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. The graveyard was empty, but something was wrong. The headstones, they had shifted, not fallen, not cracked, turned. Each one was now facing him. Then a sound from the trees, a dry, brittle clicking noise, like bones tapping together. Richard stepped backward, his breath sharp, his entire body tight with dread. The wind stirred the leaves, and through the branches something moved. Not an animal, not a man. Something in between. Then the whispering returned. "You took me from the earth. Now I take from you." Richard's blood turned to ice. The footprints, the missing bones, the letter that had warned him. He still walks. Something was in the house, and it wasn't human. The thing in the attic. Richard ran. He tore across the graveyard, his breath ragged, his pulse hammering in his ears. The lantern swung wildly in his grip as he raced back up the steps of the manor. Mrs. Weatherby was gone. The front doors were wide open. The candles inside had all gone out. Richard stepped inside. The house was wrong. The air felt heavy, thick with something he couldn't see. And then, a thump from upstairs. Loud, deliberate. Richard's pulse spiked. Then another, a slow, dragging sound. From the attic. The house groaned around him, the wooden beams creaking as if something was pressing against them. Then a single footprint appeared in the dust, not made by flesh, but by bone. Richard felt the weight of the skull still wrapped in cloth inside his study, the piece that had been missing from the grave. The skeleton was coming back together, piece by piece, bone to its bone, the shadow without flesh. The footprint in the dust was fresh, and it was not human. Richard could not move. His breath caught in his throat as he watched the print settle into the wooden floor. He had seen plenty of footprints in his time, wet, muddy ones from his own boots, the faint drag marks of Mrs. Weatherby's worn slippers. But this was different. This was bare bone pressing into the dust. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears, his mind screamed at him to run. But he didn't, because above him, something moved. The attic. The slow, rhythmic thumping from the ceiling sent a fresh wave of dread curling in his stomach. It was deliberate, measured. Something was walking above him, something without flesh. Richard's grip tightened around the lantern handle. He turned toward the staircase, his legs heavy as he forced himself forward. Each step creaked under his weight, the air thick with dust and silence. The door to the attic was slightly open, not wide, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond, a space too black to be natural. Richard swallowed. The house was listening. He knew this was a mistake, but he pushed the door open anyway. The thing in the attic. The lantern's glow flickered as if something in the attic did not want it there. The air stank of decay. Not fresh rot, but something older. Something that had been waiting. Richard stepped inside. The attic was cluttered with centuries-old furniture, forgotten trunks, dust-covered mirrors. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, and the wooden beams overhead groaned as the wind battered the manor. Richard scanned the room, his breath shallow, and then he saw it. At the far end of the attic, nestled between a tall cabinet and a rotting chair, was something wrong. A pile of bones, not scattered, not broken, arranged. Richard's stomach twisted violently. It was a full skeleton, but incomplete. The skull was missing. He stepped closer, his heart hammering. The bones were clean, too clean for something that had been buried for centuries. Then, a low, rattling breath, not from Richard, not from the wind, from the bones. His entire body locked up. The attic creaked, and then the skeleton moved. The bones that remembered Richard stumbled back, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. The bones shifted, the fingers twitched, and then, slowly, too slowly, the skeletal hand dragged itself forward. A horrible, dry scraping sound filled the attic. The ribcage lifted slightly, the spine twisted. The skeleton was assembling itself. Richard felt a scream claw at his throat. He turned, rushing for the attic door, but before he could reach it, a voice whispered behind him, "You took me from the earth." Richard froze. The whisper had come from the bones. "Now I take from you." Something brushed against his ankle. Richard jerked away, nearly dropping the lantern. The skeleton's hand had reached for him. Not in anger, not in violence, but in recognition, because it knew him, because he had the skull, the missing piece, the last bone it needed. Richard staggered out of the attic, slamming the door behind him. The moment the latch clicked, the whispering stopped. The air in the hallway was suddenly still. Richard's pulse thundered as he pressed his back against the door, his hands shaking. But he knew, this wasn't over, the bones would not stop. Not until they were whole, not until they were put back together, and Richard had exactly what they were looking for, the mark of the dead. Richard ran, down the stairs through the dimly lit corridor, back to the study where the skull still sat, wrapped in cloth, waiting. Mrs. Weatherby was already there, her face ashen. "You found it, didn't you?" she whispered. Richard nodded, swallowing hard. "The bones, I know." She cut him off. Her voice was tight, her fingers gripping the back of the chair until her knuckles turned white. "They never left." Richard took a shaky step forward. Who was he? Mrs. Weatherby's face was shadowed in the candlelight. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the desk, toward the wrapped skull. "You have to put it back," she whispered. Richard felt the weight of the words sink into his bones. The bones weren't just moving. They were looking for him. He reached out with trembling fingers, pulling back the cloth. The skull grinned up at him. It was still too clean, still too white. And then the windows burst open. A howling wind tore through the room, sending papers flying, rattling the bookshelves. Richard turned sharply, and his breath caught. The attic door was open. The lantern had gone out. And at the top of the staircase, a figure stood. Not flesh, not human, the skeleton, and it was complete. Richard's pulse spiked violently. Then it moved. Its jaw clicked open, and the whispering returned. Bone to his bone. Richard's vision blurred with terror. The skeleton lifted its arm. Its hand was reaching for him. The wind roared. The house shook. And for the first time in his life, Reverend Richard Henderson screamed. The corpse that walks. The skeleton stepped forward. Richard's breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse pounding so violently it hurt. The bones moved unnaturally, joints snapping into place with sickening clicks, its limbs adjusting as if it was remembering how to walk. And its empty eye sockets were locked on him. Bone to his bone. The whisper coiled through the room, wrapping around Richard's throat like a phantom hand tightening its grip. Mrs. Weatherby gasped, clutching the cross at her throat, her voice trembling. "It's too late." Richard tried to step back, but his legs wouldn't obey. The skeleton, the thing that had been buried in the cursed grave, was waiting. Waiting for what? Waiting for him. Then the skull on the desk twitched. Richard's gaze snapped downward. The skull moved again. Then, before he could react, it flew from the desk, straight toward the waiting skeleton. The final piece. The moment the skull touched its rightful place, something shifted in the air. The wind died, the house stopped trembling, and then a terrible wet sound filled the room. Richard couldn't look away. The bones were knitting themselves together, not in a normal way, not with joints, not with sinew. The air itself pulled them together. Threads of darkness wove through the gaps, binding each bone with something unseen, something unnatural. The ribcage rose, the spine snapped into alignment, the fingers curled, twitching like a newborn testing its limbs for the first time. And then, with a sickening crack, the skull settled into place. The skeleton stood taller now, whole, complete. And it was breathing. The grinning dead. Richard felt the urge to run, but his body was frozen in place, locked under the weight of something he couldn't see but could feel. The skeleton tilted its head, its jaw parting slightly, and then, in a voice not made for this world, it laughed. Not loud, not maniacal, but soft, like it was amused. Richard's vision blurred, nausea curling in his stomach. This wasn't a spirit. This wasn't just a curse. It was something worse, something alive. Then the skeleton moved again. It took another step forward, but this time it wasn't dragging itself. It walked, fluidly, purposefully. It was fully restored, and its black, empty sockets had not left Richard once. Mrs. Weatherby stumbled backward, her face stark white. "Don't let it touch you," she whispered. Richard's throat went dry. "What does it want?" The skeleton's grin widened. "It wants what was taken," Mrs. Weatherby whispered. Richard's stomach dropped. What was taken? Mrs. Weatherby's eyes flickered toward him, and in that moment, Richard knew. Him. It was here for him. Because he had been chosen. The skeleton speaks. The skeleton raised a bony hand. The whispering filled the room once more, not in English, not in Latin, but something older, something primal. The windows rattled violently, the candle flames burned blue, and Richard felt a horrible pull deep inside his chest. A feeling like his own bones were responding to the thing before him. It lifted one skeletal finger and pointed directly at him. Richard's body locked up, his vision blurred as his limbs turned cold, his muscles weakening, the bones inside him, his very structure, responding. Then, the skeleton spoke. Its jaw didn't move, but the voice filled the air, filled his head, whispering inside his skull. "You stole my grave." Richard staggered back. No, that wasn't right. "I didn't." The skeleton took another step forward. "You stole my rest." Richard's breath hitched. "I didn't dig you up." The skeleton's jaw twitched. "You wear my name." A wave of nausea slammed into Richard's stomach. His vision blurred, and for a split second he saw, not himself, but another man, dressed in black robes, standing over a freshly dug grave, holding a stolen skull. Richard's fingers trembled. Had he been here before? Number impossible. This was his first time at Thornwick Manor, wasn't it? Wasn't it? The skeleton's head tilted. "Bone to his bone," it whispered. Then the entire manor shook. The skeleton that refused to stay buried. Richard felt his legs give out as the whispering reached a deafening crescendo. The walls cracked, dust pouring from the ceiling as if the house itself were about to collapse. Mrs. Weatherby's scream cut through the chaos. "The grave, Reverend! You must return it to the grave!" Richard's breath shuddered. The grave. Of course, the bones weren't supposed to be here. They were never supposed to leave. With a sudden burst of clarity, Richard lunged for the skull. The skeleton moved faster than it should have, its bony hands reaching, its fingers curling toward him. Richard snatched the skull off the floor, turned, and ran. The skeleton's scream rattled through the house, shaking the walls, cracking the floor beneath him. Richard barreled down the hallway, the skeletal footsteps echoing behind him. Every door burst open as he passed, the whispers calling his name, trying to drag him down. But he didn't stop. He ran, through the corridor, through the open door, out into the cold, dead air of the graveyard, and the skeleton followed. The earth demands its due. The yew trees twisted violently, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. The well-worn family graves stood in silence, but the unmarked grave at the edge of the land, it was waiting. The wind howled as Richard stumbled forward, his fingers tightening around the skull. Behind him, the skeleton was nearly upon him, its steps no longer staggered. It was running, the ground rumbled beneath them, and then Richard threw the skull into the open grave. The earth convulsed. The skeleton let out a horrible, distorted shriek, its bones splintering, its body collapsing as if unseen hands had grabbed hold of it and dragged it down. The moment the skull touched the waiting soil, the grave sealed itself. The wind died, the earth stilled, and the whispering stopped. For the first time in centuries, Edgar Thornwick was whole again. The silence after death. Richard collapsed onto his knees, his breath ragged, the cold air slicing into his skin. It was over. It had to be. Mrs. Weatherby knelt beside him, her face lined with exhaustion, but relief. She nodded. You did what had to be done. Richard stared at the grave. Then a single bone lay beside it. The last one. As he reached for it, a voice echoed behind him. Bone to his bone. Richard turned, and the skeleton grinned. The whispering bones. The skeleton was still grinning. Richard couldn't move. His breath came in ragged gasps, his entire body frozen as he watched the thing rise again. It should have been gone. The skull was returned. The bones were whole. The grave had sealed itself, and yet the last bone remained above the earth. Richard stared down at it, his fingers inches from the fragment of yellowed ancient bone, its surface smooth, too clean for something that had been buried for centuries. It was a piece of a finger, the final piece. The skeleton's grin widened, bone to his bone. The whisper was inside his head now. Richard jerked back, his pulse hammering. No, he breathed. No, you're whole now. You're buried. It's over. Mrs. Weatherby grabbed his arm, her face pale, her hands trembling violently. It's not over, she whispered. Richard's stomach twisted. The air had changed. The wind had stopped. The graveyard was silent. And yet something was breathing. The bone that shouldn't exist. Richard's hand shook as he reached for the final bone. The skeleton's empty sockets followed him. The whispering grew louder. You stole from me. The ground beneath him shuddered. You took what was mine. The trees creaked, and then a hand burst from the grave. Richard stumbled back, a cry tearing from his throat as fingers clawed their way out of the earth. Not bones, flesh, grey, rotting. The skeleton was rebuilding itself again. Not as bones, as something else, something that refused to stay buried. Richard turned to Mrs. Weatherby, panic rising in his chest. What's happening? She was shaking her head, her breath shallow. You left a piece behind, she said. Her eyes were wet with terror. The earth only accepts the dead if they're whole. The grave was rejecting it, rejecting him, the thing that rose again. The whispering became a scream. The dirt exploded outward, a burst of rotting soil and dust swallowing the air. The skeleton was changing. It was no longer just bones. The flesh that should have rotted away had stitched itself back together, sinew threading into place, veins snaking over the bones like living vines. Its jaw snapped back into place, teeth setting with a sickening click. And when it finally stood, it was no longer a corpse. It was something else, something that should not exist. And it was staring at him. Richard felt his entire body turn to ice. Mrs. Weatherby let out a choked sob. No, she whispered, not again. The thing stepped forward, the earth beneath its feet withered, and then it spoke. Not in a whisper, not in the voice of something long dead, but in a voice that was too close to Richard's own. I am not finished. The words felt wrong, like they were pulling something out of him. His bones ached, his limbs felt heavy, like something was dragging him down. Then the creature moved faster than he thought possible. Richard barely had time to stumble back as the thing lunged. Its hand stretched toward him, not for his throat, not for his heart, but for the bone in his hand. The final piece, the choice Richard knew. If it got the last bone, it would be whole, not a ghost, not a skeleton, but something else entirely, something that would never die again. The moment his fingers tightened around the bone, the whispering screeched, "Give it back." Mrs. Weatherby grabbed his arm. "Bury it," she screamed. The thing snapped its head toward her, its neck twisted too far, bones cracking, skin stretching like old leather. Mrs. Weatherby froze, the creature grinned. And then it moved. Richard acted before he could think. With everything he had, he threw the bone into the open grave. The instant the bone hit the dirt, the world shattered. The earth takes what it is owed. A force slammed into Richard's chest, knocking him off his feet. The wind roared as the earth convulsed, the grave widening, cracks splintering across the cemetery. The creature screamed, not in anger, not in rage, but in fear. The grave was pulling it back. It thrashed, flesh unraveling, bones snapping apart, fingers clawing at the air as the soil swallowed it whole. Its jaw unhinged, mouth stretching wide, and the last thing Richard saw before the earth dragged it down was its grin. The ground sealed itself. The whispering died. The wind stopped. And then, the graveyard was silent. The final bone. Richard lay on his back, panting, his heart slamming against his ribs. Mrs. Weatherby sat beside him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. The grave was closed. For the first time in centuries, it was whole. Richard sat up, his muscles aching, his body trembling. It was over. It had to be. And then, something caught his eye. A single bone, left behind in the dirt. Richard's breath shook. Mrs. Weatherby's face turned pale. "You have to leave it," she whispered. But Richard's hand was already reaching out. The wind stirred. The ground shifted. The air grew heavy again, and just as his fingers brushed the bone, a voice whispered from behind him, "Bone to his bone." Richard turned, and something was standing there, smiling, the skeleton that refused to stay buried. The whisper had returned, "Bone to his bone." The words were not carried by the wind. They were not spoken by Mrs. Weatherby. They came from behind him. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered above the last bone, his skin crawling as the weight of the air thickened around him. Slowly, too slowly, he turned. And there, standing in the graveyard, was the thing that refused to stay buried. It should not have been there. The grave was sealed. The bones were returned. The earth had taken what it was owed. And yet, it had come back. The thing that wore bones. It was no longer just a skeleton, it was more. The flesh had returned, but it was wrong. Rotten, wet sinew clung to the bone like an unfinished sculpture. The skin was half-formed, folded over muscle, patches of it stretching too tight across the skull. And yet the grin remained. Its lips had not fully covered its teeth. Blackened veins pulsed beneath the yellowed skin, and its eyes, if they could be called that, were nothing but deep, empty sockets sinking into an abyss that should not exist. The bones shifted beneath the flesh as if they did not quite fit together properly. But the worst part, the part that made Richard's stomach twist in horror, was that the thing still looked like him, like it had taken something from him, like it had been made in his image. It took a step forward. The grave rejected it, and now it wanted something else. The house calls it back. The wind howled violently, kicking up dead leaves and loose earth. The graveyard trembled beneath their feet, but the thing did not move with the wind. It was not part of this world anymore. Mrs. Weatherby grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him back. "Don't look at it," she whispered. "It feeds on recognition. If you see it, if you acknowledge it, it becomes real." Richard couldn't speak. His mouth wouldn't form words. Because the thing had already seen him. It had always seen him. And now, it knew him. The wind screamed through the yew trees, and in the distance the manor doors burst open. The house was calling it back. The grave had rejected the bones. But the house would take them. The thing tilted its head, bones creaking beneath the loose layers of stitched flesh. Its gaze never left Richard. Then it moved, not walking, not running, just shifting forward, as if it had always been closer than he realized. The chase through Thornwick Manor. Richard turned and ran. Mrs. Weatherby followed, their feet pounding against the soft dirt as they sprinted back toward the manor. The thing moved behind them, but it did not run. It did not have to. The house was waiting. The doors swung wider, the entry hall shrouded in shadows that stretched unnaturally up the walls, twisting into long, thin fingers. Richard barely noticed. He and Mrs. Weatherby burst through the threshold, the air inside colder than death itself. The moment they crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut. The manor trapped them inside. The house remembers. The candlelight in the hallways flickered as if the flames were gasping for air. The floorboards beneath them creaked violently, not from their steps, but from something else moving beneath the wood. Mrs. Weatherby clutched her rosary, muttering prayers under her breath. Richard spun around, his chest heaving. The thing was no longer behind them, but it was inside the house. He could feel it. The bones were still walking, and they were closer than before. Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaked open. Then another. Then another. The house was letting it in. The walls groaned like a dying breath, and Richard realized the manor was not rejecting the dead. It was welcoming it home. The skeleton walks the halls from above. Footsteps. Not one pair, not two. Many, slow, dragging steps filled the air, each one soaked in unbearable silence. Richard turned to Mrs. Weatherby, his voice shaking. "What do we do?" She did not look at him. Her eyes were on the staircase, the long, winding staircase leading to the second floor and to the attic. Richard swallowed hard. The attic, where the bones had first moved, where the whispers had first begun. The attic was where it wanted to go, and he had to follow. The assembling of the dead. Richard forced his feet forward, following the sound of the steps, each movement heavier than the last. Mrs. Weatherby stayed behind, her voice hoarse. "Reverend, don't—" But he already knew. There was no stopping this. Not anymore. He reached the top of the stairs, and the air turned thick with dust and decay. The attic door was wide open. Richard stepped inside, and saw them. The bones were not alone. The attic was filled with others. Skeletons stood in the shadows, their frames barely visible in the flickering candlelight. They were not complete, but they were trying to be. Some were missing hands, some were missing skulls. They all turned toward him and whispered in unison, "Bone to his bone." Richard's vision blurred with terror. Then the last bone in his hand shifted. Not by force, by will. It wanted to return, and Richard realized if he gave it back, it would finally be whole, and it would never stop walking again. The final horror. The manor groaned, the weight of unrested dead pressing against its walls. Richard had only one choice. He had to finish this. With every ounce of strength left in him, he hurled the last bone into the open coffin at the center of the attic. The moment it hit the rotting wood, the skeleton lurched forward. The whispering turned into a scream. The bones snapped together violently, forming a horrid, twisting shape, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it tried to complete itself. Then, the house trembled. The candles died. The whispering stopped. For one horrible second, all was still. And then, the earth took it back. The skeleton collapsed into dust. The attic was empty again. But Richard knew it was not gone. It was waiting. And if another bone was ever disturbed, it would return. The final horror. The dust had not settled. Richard's chest heaved, his breath ragged as the attic stood silent around him. The skeleton, the thing that refused to stay buried, had collapsed, its bones scattered, its form reduced to dust. And yet, the air was still wrong, too heavy, too thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Weatherby's whispers of prayer barely reached his ears. She stood at the doorway, her face drained of color, her fingers clenched around her rosary. Richard swallowed, his throat dry. It was over. It had to be. Then, the whispering returned, bone to his bone. The house remembers. The manor groaned, its wooden beams creaking under invisible pressure. The attic floor was cold beneath Richard's feet, and a wave of nausea curled in his stomach as the whispers grew louder. Something was still here. Not flesh, not spirit, but memory. The bones had been scattered, the skeleton destroyed, but something still remained. And then, a single knock. Not on the walls, not on the door, beneath the floorboards. Richard's breath hitched. Slowly, shaking, he knelt. He pressed his hand to the wooden planks, his palm trembling against the cold grain. Another knock. Then, a voice muffled coming from beneath the floor. "You forgot one." The last bone. Richard's stomach turned to ice. His hands trembled as he reached for the loose floorboard near the collapsed skeleton. The air was thick with silence, the flickering candlelight casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. He knew, before he even pulled it up, there was one bone left. And it had been waiting. With slow, shaking fingers, he pried the plank loose. The moment it lifted, a gust of cold air rushed through the attic. Not wind. Something else, something breathing. And there, beneath the floor, a single bone. White, unmarked by time. A finger. Richard's pulse pounded. Mrs. Weatherby stepped back, shaking her head violently. "Don't touch it," she rasped. But Richard was already reaching out. His fingers brushed the cold surface, and then the manor came alive. The bones awaken. The whispering turned into screaming. The house shuddered violently, dust pouring from the rafters, the wooden beams groaning as if something inside the walls was shifting. Richard fell back, his vision blurring as the shadows stretched toward him. The dust that had once been a skeleton began to move, reforming, reshaping, not into bones, not into flesh, but into something else, something that had never been meant to walk this world. And in the flickering light, Richard finally saw it. It was not just a man, not just Edgar Thornwick. It was all of them. All the bones, all the dead, stacked together, merged into a single shifting shape, a twisting mass of skulls, ribs and hands, their fingers reaching out, their jawbones moving in unison. A voice rose from the mass, not from one mouth, but from many. "You made me whole." Richard's heart slammed into his ribs. "You put me together." Mrs. Weatherby screamed. The thing moved. The walls buckled inward, the manor groaning as if it were collapsing into itself. The shadows bled from the walls, stretching toward him. He had put the bones back. And now it was complete. It was waking up. The final banishment. Richard knew he had one chance, one way to end this. His breath shook as he reached into his coat pocket, his grandfather's matches. The house was made of wood. The bones had lived in this house for too long. Now the house would die with them. He lit the match. The creature screamed. The manor shook. The fire caught immediately, racing up the old wooden walls, devouring the rafters. Mrs. Weatherby grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the staircase. The bones howled as they began to crumble, the fire licking at them, turning centuries of death into nothing but ash. The manor was burning. The shadows were fading, and as the roof collapsed, Richard heard one last whisper. "We will wait." Then, silence. The aftermath. Richard stood in the cold morning light, the ruins of old Thornwick Manor still smouldering behind him. The bones were gone, burned, destroyed, finally laid to rest. Mrs. Weatherby stood beside him, staring into the charred remains of the past. "It's over," she whispered. But Richard wasn't sure, because when the wind shifted, stirring the ashes, a single bone rolled free. White, unburned, waiting. Richard's hands shook. The whisper returned, bone to his bone. And in the distant remains of the ruins, something grinned. The end.